It's on Zechariah 12, page 847. Zechariah 12 through to 13:9. Zechariah 12, verse 1. A pronouncement, the word of the Lord concerning Israel. A declaration of the Lord who stretched out the heavens, laid the foundation of the earth, and formed the spirit of man within him. Look, I will make Jerusalem a cup that causes staggering for the peoples who surround the city. The siege against Jerusalem will also involve Judah. On that day, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. All who try to lift it will injure themselves severely when all the nations of the earth gather against her. On that day, this is the Lord's declaration, I will strike every horse with panic and its rider with madness. I will keep a watchful eye on the house of Judah, but strike all the horses of the nations with blindness. Then each of the leaders of Judah will think to himself, the residents of Jerusalem are my strength through the Lord of armies, their God. On that day, I will make the leaders of Judah like a fire pot in a woodpile. Like a flaming torch among sheaves, they will consume all the peoples around them on the right and the left, while Jerusalem continues to be inhabited on its site in Jerusalem. The Lord will save the tents of Judah first, so that the glory of David's house and the glory of Jerusalem's residents may not be greater than that of Judah. On that day, the Lord will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that on that day the one who is weakest among them will be like David on that day, and the house of David will be like God, like the angel of the Lord before them. On that day I will set out to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. Then I'll pour out a spirit of grace and prayer on the house of David and the residents of Jerusalem. And they will look at me whom they have pierced. They will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly for him as one weeps for a firstborn. On that day the mourning in Jerusalem will be as great as the mourning of Hadad-rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. The land will mourn, every family by itself, the family of David's house by itself, and their women by themselves, the family of Nathan's house by itself, and their women by themselves, the family of Levi's house by itself and their women by themselves, the family of Shimei by itself and their women by themselves, all the remaining families, every family by itself and their women by themselves. On that day, a fountain will be opened for the house of David and for the residents of Jerusalem to wash away sin and impurity. On that day, this is the declaration of the Lord of armies, I will remove the names of the idols from the land, and they will no longer be remembered. I will banish the prophets and the unclean spirit from the land. If a man still prophesies, his father and his mother who bore him will say to him, you cannot remain alive because you've spoken a lie in the name of the Lord. When he prophesies, his father and his mother who bore him will pierce him through. On that day, every prophet will be ashamed of his vision. When he prophesies, they will not put on a hairy cloak in order to deceive. He will say, I am not a prophet. I worked the land, for a man purchased me as a servant since my youth. If someone asks him, what are these wounds on your chest? Then he'll answer, I received the wounds in the house of my friends. Sword awake against my shepherd, against the man who is my associate, is the declaration of the Lord of armies. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. I will turn my hand against the little ones. In the whole land, this is the Lord's declaration. 2/3 will be cut off and die, but 1/3 will be left in it. I will put this third through the fire. I will refine them as silver is refined and test them as gold is tested. They will call on the name and I will answer them. And I will say, they are my people. And they will say, the Lord is our God. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning. I'm going to start with a joke, if that's okay. There we go. It's about good news and bad news. This is the Gabba yesterday. It was rained out, a mixture of good news and bad news. Anyway, that's not the joke. Two old sportsmen are, they've been companions since boyhood, playing together, love cricket, love talking about cricket and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, one of them one day has a turn, wakes up in hospital and his mate's beside him. He turns to his mate and says, I've seen it. There's good news and there's bad news. Good news is there's cricket in heaven. And they just enjoy that for a few minutes. And then his mate says, you said there was bad news. Well, yeah, I had a word to the selectors and I know all your thoughts on this subject and they're going to take you on. And I said, yeah, that sounds great. That sounds like really good news. But you said it was bad news. He said, well, mate, the bad news is you're opening the batting on Friday. In heaven, of course. Good news and bad news. And that's a bit like this passage. And it's a bit like the Middle East in general, isn't it? You know, you hear all the stuff that's happening over in Israel and in Syria and thinks, what on earth is going on there? And it seems to be going on there all the time. You know, for the last year, since October the 7th last year, when Palestinian groups came in and kidnapped 1,000 or so Israelis, and then backwards and forwards, army raids and so on. And you think all that news is old, because that's been happening for 3,000 years. It's a really conflicted part of the world. Control of that territory has gone from Egypt to Babylon, to Syria, Persia, Greece, Rome, and then, a couple of times around in those kind of things. It all starts again. And I was thinking, I was in a doctor's surgery recently and I was, in the waiting and I was in the corridor for that. And it feels a bit like that part of the world, Palestine, is like waiting in the corridor outside accident and emergency at a major hospital. There are quiet periods, but most of the time people are rushing backwards and forwards and there's a lot of blood. It's a good place to avoid, but it's not a place that we can avoid. Because Christianity is not just a philosophy with some good ideas. It's rooted in history. It's rooted in people and places. And when you come to Zechariah, it's confusing. Everyone says it is. There's a couple of commentators that say these are the most confusing 6 chapters in the Bible, from 9 to 14. But we know it's important. And we know it's important because these 6 chapters are quoted in the Passion narratives, the story of Jesus' last days. They're quoted more than any other part of the Bible. So Jesus and the early church thought that these chapters were important, and so we need to try and understand them at least a little bit. We may not understand all the details, but we should try and understand the main points that are coming out. Think about what these chapters have had so far. Chapter 9, we've had the donkey. Chapter 10, we've had the cornerstone image. Chapter 11, we've already had the 30 pieces of silver. All of these images come into the Passion narratives. And in these 2 chapters, we've got 2 more references. The pierced one and the striking of the shepherd and the scattering of the sheep. These are passages which Jesus knew really well. I won't have time to go through everything. But let's start with some good news. And we start with a siege. That doesn't sound like good news, but the good news is that God is going to look after them. We don't know exactly when the siege is that was talked about in these verses, but because Jerusalem was besieged at various times. But the point is clear. God himself will ensure that his people will get through this. And God brings various illustrations to bear to assure the people that that is what's going to happen, that God is going to defend the city and bring judgment on those who wish it ill. The cup of staggering. Now, there's a couple of times in the Bible when a cup means blessing. My cup overflows in the Psalms, for example. But most of the references to cups in the Bible are cups of judgment. And that is what God is bringing on these nations that come against Israel. Then there's the heavy stone. And apparently the word in Hebrew indicates that people are going to be cut when they try and lift this stone. It's not everyone's going to get a hernia. And then there's a few references to military forces and madness and panic and blindness, which kind of refer back to the passages in the Red Sea where Israel is crossing over and the Egyptian army is thrown into a panic and madness. And possibly also a reference in 2 Kings to Elisha's victory over the Arameans. Finally, there's this image of fire pots and flaming torches. And the flaming torches kind of reminds us of the time when Samson the judge took torches and tied 2 foxes together and let them loose in the Palestinian fields of wheat. But the point is, God is going to defend Israel and Jerusalem. God is not saying you'll never have enemies. Israel has always had enemies, and Jews continue to have enemies even here in Australia, in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago, in Sydney this week. There's been graffiti and so on. What this passage is saying is that even though Israel will have enemies, God will defend his people. On that day, I will set out to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. And then I reflect on this and I think, how do I feel about that in relation to all the news that happens? I'm in 2 minds. Clearly, the Jews have been persecuted for millennia. And even today, they have their enemies. On the other hand, you wonder, at least from hearing the news reports, Israel behaves very hawkishly, always ready, in preemptive strikes and over punishing things. You wonder. But when we read our Bibles, you know that there is something special about Israel. And Paul talks about that as well. And I just don't know how it fits all together. And I'm uncomfortable about that. And I need to stay in that space. I need not to be pushed towards a binary decision yet. I realise I don't know enough, and I need to find out more of that history. Not just trust the news services that you're getting, but to dig a bit deeper. Most importantly, I need to read my Bible and pray and say, what does God really want to do with these things? So that's an encouragement for me, and that's something I need to do. Let's get on to some bad news then. Mourning for the pierced one. The scene has changed in some way, and the focus isn't on the nations anymore, it's on Israel itself and what they are doing. I will pour out a spirit of grace and prayer on the house of David and the residents of Jerusalem, and they will look on me whom they pierced. They will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly for him as one weeps for a firstborn. Something has happened to provoke mourning, and it is deep mourning. Someone has died. The mourning is intense. It is the end of a family line, of inheritance, of legacy, of name. But we don't quite know what it is yet. Verse 11 continues, "On that day the mourning in Jerusalem will be as great as the mourning of Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo." Now this gives us a bit of a hint about context. Now there's different commentators, but the best explanation, I think, is that this is talking about the son of Ammon, of Josiah. It's as if saying Megiddo to an Israeli is like saying Gallipoli to an Australian. It's the site of many great battles, and in fact it's, let me show you a picture. This is from Nazareth looking down on this wide plain. It's like 20 kilometres wide, and it's at the top of the Gaza Strip and all of that coastal area up. Mount Carmel's, kind of on your right in this picture. And there's a pass that goes through, and Megiddo's at the end of the pass. And Josiah comes out and attacks Pharaoh Necho of Egypt as he's on his way to meet Persians or something. Josiah disguises himself in battle, but he's hit with a stray arrow and dies. Josiah is the last great king, the last good king of Israel. And all the hopes and dreams of Israel have died with Josiah. It is a tragedy. And they are saying here in this passage that this piercing is like that. The mourning is deep. But there's something else about this. There's a couple more things to notice as we go through this mourning. Let me read verses 12 to 14. You can follow along, please do. "The land will mourn, every family by itself. The family of David's house by itself, and their women by themselves. The family of Nathan's house by itself, and their women by themselves. The family of Levi's house by itself, and their women by themselves. The family of Shimei by itself, and their women by themselves. All the remaining families, every family by itself, and their women by themselves." The first thing I notice is how universal this is. David's house means the kings and the king's family. Nathan was David's prophet, so it's kind of saying all the prophets. Levi was the ancestor of all the priests, so it's saying all the priests. And Shimei, that's a bit more difficult, but I think it's referring to the man that curses David as David runs away from Absalom. And so it's saying even David's enemies, they're mourning. And just to make sure, everyone else, every other family is mourning as well. The whole of Israel, there are no winners in this. It's universal. But the second thing I notice about this is the recognition of guilt. Stay with me. Here's my line of reasoning. When there is a loss, people mourn. But when something bad happens, it just happens, like a typhoon or a cyclone or a flood, and people lose things, I think the tendency is to come together and support each other. But when there is guilt or a hint of responsibility, people tend to separate. Here's my example. Next time you watch a grand final, the TV cameras zone in on the winning team and they're all up and celebrating, don't they? Aren't they? They're jumping about, they're enjoying each other, they're hugging themselves and so on. And then the camera pans back and you see ones and twos lying on the ground, deflated. They're all separate. They're all thinking, what part did I play? What could I have done better? And that is a bit like what this is happening here. As each person here is thinking, what did I do as part of this? What part did I play in this piercing, in this death? And that is why I think we are seeing guilt reflected. Every group, all 10 groups mentioned, he goes on and on. Every group by itself. The picture is devastating. Everyone is mourning. No one's hero has won the day. Everyone feels responsible. And this is the picture that we have when John, in his Gospel, chapter 19, talks about Jesus at the end of his life. He's died. The soldier has just made sure by piercing his side. And John recalls this. He says, they will look on the one that they have pierced. Have you been in a situation where someone has been teased or bullied? Have you felt the shame and the guilt of really hurting someone yourself, even if you didn't mean to? Or seeing someone hurt when you felt that maybe you should have done something? That sense of guilt is hard to forget. I can think of a few times in my life where I've been part of that or watched it and could have done something. And every so often my mind goes back and I get a flush of shame. And I pray to God that I've forgiven for that. But I'm powerless to do anything, and all I can do is pray at this time for those things, those people I'm no longer in contact with. And that guilt is bad news. But God has good news too. God has a solution. And we turn to chapter 13, and the first verse there is great news. On that day, a fountain will be opened for the house of David and for the residents of Jerusalem to wash away sin and impurity. Is this not good news? Of course it is. Our guilt can be washed away, and we're not sure exactly how that happens, but it happens. And we all want to wash in that fountain, to be freed of that guilt and shame. But I have to warn you, that isn't the end of the chapter. That fountain is just the first part of God's program. Let me put this picture in your mind. Imagine you've just had your Christmas party and it's a mess in your house. Absolute mess. And you think, I can't face it, I'm calling a cleaner. Cleaner rocks up to the door, you open the door, there's the cleaner, and then over their shoulder you see there's a skip. You're thinking, gee, I had a big night, but I didn't have that big a night. And you ask, what's the skip for? Well, it's all part of the package deal. I said, well, you know, all those broken mugs you've got in the back of your crockery cupboard, and, you know, there's all those medals, you know, when you came 7,534th in the city to surf. And there are those old undies which crackle and obviously don't stay up anymore. And there's your first year uni notes, and there's all this stuff that you don't need. We're going to get rid of it. And all these books that you think, well, they're really not the right books, they shouldn't be read. We're going to get rid of it all. And you think, you can't deny the truth of those things, but you're kind of sentimentally attached to it all, aren't you? And that's the program that God has got here going on. He's going to get rid of all these idols. And the prophets that they're talking about in these passages are all false prophets. They're prophets of Baal parading as prophets of Israel. And God is taking this seriously. And God is bringing such repentance upon the people that they will take God seriously. And it's hard to read when you read of a father and a mother handing over their son to be executed because they've been saying the wrong things. And even these false prophets are ashamed, and they're running away from the things that they have said. And they're shedding their clothes. I watched a TV report on the ABC, or from the ABC, and it was going through and saying all the Syrian outposts, the border posts are empty. And then the guy comes in and there's these uniforms on the ground and boots. The Syrian army fled, got rid of everything so that they wouldn't be associated with the army. And this is what's happening to the prophets. They're getting rid of their mantles, the cloak of Elisha and Elijah. They don't want to be seen as prophets. And when they're talking about the scars on the body, think about 1 Kings 18, where Elisha is getting the prophets of Baal, and they're cutting themselves. That is all part of that worship. So this is good news, but it's become uncomfortable, hasn't it? I want to be more like Christ. I want to get rid of the junk in my life, but I'm kind of attached to it. I mean, really attached to things that I shouldn't be attached to. And I want someone to come into my life who'll be gentle with me and gently get rid of stuff. Well, there's a bit more bad news. 7 to 9. Chapter 13 seems to be finishing like chapter 12 with the death of a leader. Verse 7 tells us that the shepherd will be struck, killed, and the sheep will be scattered. And Jesus took this as referring to himself when he warned his disciples at the Last Supper in Matthew chapter 26. In verse 8, we learn that only a portion of those who are led, a minority, only a third will survive. That's hard to hear. Verse 9, we learn that the remaining third will also be put through the fire. It seems that they will suffer. And they will be purified through that suffering. Suffering is maybe not for everyone, but it's certainly a possibility for all Christians. There are some churches that preach that when you become a Christian, everything is going to be fantastic. You'll become rich, you'll be successful, all your diseases will be healed. And I worry about those who preach such things because I don't think they've read these verses. I don't think they've read, the passion story of Jesus, and I don't think they've read much of the New Testament. Because that is not what Jesus says. Following Jesus is the right thing to do, but it may involve suffering. Let me bring this to a close with a few thoughts. First thing, I want to be cautious about interpreting world events. When you watch or read the news, it is rare that we get the full picture. It's rarely completely good news, and it's rarely completely bad news. Be careful about making binary judgments about such things, especially about events in the Middle East. I'm not defending Bashar or his regime, but I doubt that his replacements will completely stop the persecution of Christians or Jews. Second, these chapters remind me that God's purposes often involve loss and sacrifice and suffering. And that is clearly true for Jesus. Third, I've been reminded about this concept of mourning, and I want to think more about it, about the difference between mourning for loss and mourning for guilt. Job, as portrayed by God, is without guilt, yet he suffers loss. And his friends assume that his guilt is the reason for his loss. But that's not how God has set it up in the first couple of chapters. But these chapters do remind us that there is universal guilt. And we need to mourn that guilt and look at God's solution. But fourth, God's solution for guilt is a deep clean. And I need to remember too that God's housekeeper comes with a skip. God wants to clear out stuff where I still have some stupid attachment. Those useless idols. And God doesn't want me listening to those false prophets. But finally, from the start of these chapters through to the end, I need to remember and be assured that God is on the side of his people. God wants a relationship with his people, with you and with me. And so let me read these final words from verse 9. I will put this third through the fire. I will refine them as silver is refined and test them as gold is tested. They will call on my name and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is our God. Amen.